Thank you. Hello and welcome. For those of you who might not already know me, my name is Dianne Brick, and I have been in antiques for some 35 years, trading as Amherst Antiques. I specialise in Tunbridge Ware, a wooden souvenir ware that was made mostly in the Tunbridge and Tunbridge Wells area of Kent. My talk today is part of a week of activities, an initiative launched by the British Antique Dealers Association to promote its members. I will be discussing Tunbridgeware from the late 18th and the early 19th century, and will try to cover the period of Jane Austen's lifetime between 1775 and 1817. But in reality, much of my talk will be about the period from 1790. This is because so little information exists about Tunbridgeware before this. Those of you who are Austen enthusiasts will know that Most Precious Treasures is a quote from her novel Emma and refers to a passage about a Tunbridgeware box. This is the only reference to Tunbridgeware in Austen's novels, but over the past few years, it has persuaded me to look more closely at her work in the hope that I might just be able to throw more light on Tunbridgeware in the 18th century. So what do we know about Tunbridgeware before 1800? It was first mentioned in 1697 when the intrepid traveller Celia Fiennes, who travelled England on horseback, visited Tunbridge Wells. She made notes on her journeys, which were first published as a complete edition in 1888 as Through England on a Side Saddle. Celia Fiennes wrote about all sorts of curious woodwork for sale in Tunbridge Wells, referring to it as delicate, neat and thin ware of wood, both white and lignum vitae. This description was likely to have referred to turned items such as bowls and goblets, pepper and spice mills, which were probably made of holly, sycamore or lignum vitae. Lignum was first taken to England from the West Indies and mainland to tropical America in the early 16th century. It would seem unlikely that items made of lignum were actually made in the Tunbridge Wells area, but were more likely to have been made in London, where the imported timber would have been available. Throughout most of the 18th century, we only have tantalising glimpses of Tunbridgeware in surviving correspondence, or where it was mentioned in literature. The letter writer and diarist Mary Granville, known to many by her married name Delaney and famed for her amazing botanical decoupage work, much of which is now in the British Museum, mentions in a letter of 1727 a Tunbridgeware jewellery box sent as a present and 2 Tunbridge voiders bought for her mother. Voiders were probably a type of crumb tray. Another person writing about Tunbridgeware was Samuel Derrick, Master of Ceremonies at both Bath and Tunbridge Wells in the 18th century. He wrote in a letter in 1672 about a gift of dressing glass and a set of boxes for your daughter's toilette, together with the prettiest tea chest I could lay my hands upon. The author Fanny Burney also wrote about a present, a very beautiful inkstand that she had bought at Tunbridge Wells in 1779. Fanny Burney had been lady-in-waiting to Queen Charlotte, wife of George III, between 1786 and 1791, and she recorded in her diary that she visited the Queen in 1798 with her 4-year-old son. Burney related that the Queen had some Tunbridgeware and that her son, who was probably bored, started to play with a Tunbridgeware workbox and to hit the table with a hammer. This she described as Tunbridgeware, but we have no idea what it might have looked like. Similarly, Jane Austen's niece, Anna Lefroy, wrote about Tunbridgeware that the Austen family had owned when she described a dressing room at Steventon Rectory, the Austen family home up to May 1801, where there were Tunbridgeware workboxes of oval shape, fitted up with ivory bands containing reels for silk, yard measures, etc. But neither this nor Fanny Burney's description really help us to identify Tunbridgeware from the period with any confidence. Indeed, they do not seem from this description to be appreciably different from any other non-Tunbridgeware boxes of the period. Both Fanny Burney and Jane Austen mention Tunbridgeware in their novels, but neither author tells us what it looked like. It merely implies that Tunbridgeware was a popular commodity known to both of them. Our best guess is that the white wood items mentioned by Celia Fiennes at the end of the 17th century continued to be made until the early 19th century, when we can begin to identify Tunbridgeware a little more readily. Many of these pieces were small souvenir items, and by the 19th century, they were simply painted and often with applied paper labels with a printed motto, such as a Tunbridge Wells gift, which you can see on this combined tape measure and pin holder. These labels served as cheaper imitations of inscribed enamel boxes, such as those from Bilston, which were popular at that time. Printed labels on Tunbridgeware do help us to date pieces, as many, if not all of the labels, were produced by Jasper Sprange, who lived between 1746 and 1823. He was a printer and publisher in Tunbridge Wells and is best remembered for producing the Tunbridge Wells Guide in many different editions from 1780 onwards. He was a methodical man who kept proofs of his printing from 1779. The years between 1794 and 1802 are now in the Tunbridge Wells Museum collection. The printed examples on this slide are from 1797 and have mottos such as "a trifle from a friend" and "a token of friendship." The clamp you see on the right-hand side of the screen says "Love the Giver," and that may well be about the same sort of date. The next slide shows souvenir items related to the place in which they were sold, including a number of seaside resorts. On the left, there is a delightful needlework clamp with a beehive on the side of it, which houses the tape measure, and the label says "a trifle from Tunbridge Wells." In the centre is an acorn-shaped thimble holder with a label saying "a present from Bath." And on the right, at the top, is a Margate gift, which is a snuff box. And the bottom on the right is a pincushion with a label saying "a trifle from Ramsgate." During the 18th century and into the Regency period, white wood items were also disguised by alternative finishes. A type of japanned-ware was made, such as the games box on the left. The finish was achieved by applying black paint and varnish to the white wood, often with fashionable gilded chouinaugerie scene. On the right is a basket with a faux tortoiseshell finish, achieved by scorching the white wood with hot sand. Documentary evidence exists suggesting that both finishes were from the Wise manufactory in Tunbridge. The Wise family were the longest running firm manufacturing Tunbridgeware and traded in Tunbridge for 100 years. Many of the pieces I will show you today came from the Wise family, either from Thomas Wise, who was working up until 1806, or from his nephew George Wise Sr. However, the white wood pieces without these applied finishes were more common, and many did not have paper labels applied. Some were painted, often with flowers. Our next slide shows a floral box, simply and brightly painted and inexpensive. One could imagine this to be just the type of box that Harriet Smith and Emma would have kept her most precious treasures. Just in case you are unfamiliar with Austen's novel, a Tunbridgeware box contains Harriet Smith's treasured items, a piece of sticking plaster and a pencil end, which had belonged to Mr. Elton, with whom Harriet thought she was in love. She held the parcel towards her, and Emma read the words, "Most precious treasures." Within abundance of silver paper was a pretty little Tunbridgeware box. Wealthy customers, on the other hand, were likely to have sought more elaborate pieces, such as this fine needlework basket painted with fruit and seashells. Shells often feature as collectible items in Georgian gentlemen's cabinets, and which we read about at Donwell Abbey in Emma. Mr. Knightley had done all in his power for Mr. Woodhouse's entertainment. Books of engravings, drawers of medals, cameos, corals, shell, and every other family collection within his cabinet had been prepared for his old friend. Shells are also painted on the frieze of this games box with a beautifully painted floral spray on the lid. This is unusually labelled and tells that it was made and sold by S&J Fuller, printer and stationers in Rathbone Place, established in 1809. Prints of Fuller's showroom exist showing shelves full of Tunbridgeware for sale. Theirs was one of the most fashionable businesses in London, and only second to that set up by Rudolph Ackerman in the Strand. Ackerman's business developed as a general repository of arts, supplying prints, artist materials, and decorative items, including Tunbridgeware. This print of their showroom shows customers looking at prints and other items. As well as Tunbridgeware, which had been painted commercially, plain whitewood items were also offered for sale at Ackerman's. They were intended for home decoration by genteel young ladies as a pleasing recreation. In Pride and Prejudice, we are told that Mr. Bingley was amazed that young ladies could have patience to be so very accomplished. They all paint tables, cover screens, and net purses. The basket on the left is probably an example of home painting, as it does not show a level of skill typically found on a professionally produced piece. This may well have been painted by a young lady of the house where she lived. Unfortunately, today we cannot identify where the house is. The next slide shows a basket with a cottage. Many of the painted designs on early 19th century Tunbridgeware were of rustic cottages with overhanging eaves and picturesque scenes. This was reflecting the 18th century interest in the picturesque movement, which was much admired by Jane Austen. After Jane's death in 1817, her brother Henry wrote a biographical notice for Northanger Abbey and Persuasion, in which he stated that she was enamoured of Gilpin on the picturesque. Jane introduced discussion of the picturesque to her narrative, both in Sense and Sensibility and Northanger Abbey. It is possible that the Tunbridgeware cottage designs were directly inspired by the English architect John Plaw, who lived between 1745 and 1820. He is largely remembered for 3 successful pattern books of picturesque cottages. The image on the right is a cottage design from a Plaw pattern book. I'm sure you can see similarities with the Tunbridgeware design on the basket. These same patterns might also have inspired Robert Ferrers in Sense and Sensibility to declare that he was excessively fond of a cottage. Tunbridgeware makers were also encouraged to produce, to produce 3-dimensional articles in the forms of cottages, castles, and other buildings. On the left in this slide, you see an inkwell, which the knob in the middle comes out, and you can put your pen into the inkwell that way. In the center is a needlework clamp with delightful little cottages housing spools and the tape measure. And on the right, there is a man looking over the gate of a cottage, and that is a money box. On this slide, the spool box is in the form of a single-storey cottage, which would have been made about the time of Jane Austen's death, and is documented inside with details of its journey from England to New England in 1818, returning to England again in the 21st century. Alongside the interest in the picturesque was a desire to experience sublime feelings of awe, which attracted followers, amongst other things, to vast horizons such as the sea. And what better place to view this than from a lighthouse? This was translated into Tunbridgeware in the form of an inkwell and sander, as you see on the left. Another fashionable interest from the 18th century was collecting and studying engravings, often of large country houses and other topographical subjects, including views that an inspired gentleman whilst on the grand tour. Such was the interest in prints that entire rooms could be devoted to them, and a number still survive. For example, Blickling Hall in Norfolk and Uppark in West Sussex. Typically, print rooms were small, and the prints were applied directly to the walls and surrounded with decorative borders cut to length to resemble picture frames. These could be purchased along with the prints themselves, very often from Ackermans. We read in Emma that prints featured amongst Mr. Knightley's collection, and that in Mansfield Park, Mary Crawford considered that the property deserved to feature in any collection of engravings of gentlemen's seats in the kingdom. We also know that Jane herself spent time studying prints for her entertainment. In a letter from Bath to her sister Cassandra in May 1801, Jane writes, "I adjourned after tea into the inner drawing room to look over prints. This fashion also extended to Tunbridgeware, with prints being applied to boxes, sometimes of classical subjects, sometimes representing popular pastimes, but more frequently, these were topographical. Before I move on to the topographical, I would like to share with you this box with a print of pheasant shooting. The gentleman could so easily have been Mr. Bingley from Pride and Prejudice. When you have killed your own birds, Mr. Bingley, I beg you will come here and shoot as many as you please on Mr. Bennet's manor. I'm sure he will be vastly happy to oblige you and will save all the best coveys for you." Now turning to the topographical. Brighton is certainly the most frequently found view to appear on early Tunbridgeware, largely due to the regular presence of the Prince of Wales in the town between 1788 and 1825. There is, however, no record of Jane Austen having visited, but characters in 2 of her novels go there. In Mansfield Park, Mr. and Mrs. Rushworth go to Brighton for their honeymoon, together with Julia Bertram. And in Pride and Prejudice, Lydia Bennet gave her father no peace until she was allowed to go to Brighton, from whence she was to elope with Wickham. If one could but go to Brighton, one can almost hear Lydia's plaintive cry. Many of the Tunbridgeware views are of the Royal Pavilion and the Chain Pier, but are dated in the 1820s. As they fall outside Jane Austen's lifetime, I am omitting them from this presentation and instead am concentrating on the views which were in existence at the time of Austen was writing. This slide is of the Prince of Wales' first home, a marine pavilion which was built to a design by Henry Holland in 1788. The view is on a games box dating to about 1810, and please do note that this is a rosewood veneered as opposed to being whitewood. Veneering was becoming fashionable at the end of the 18th century. The next slide is a whitewood basket with the same view. This was possibly bought with the print applied already and then home decorated, as the painting is somewhat meagre. The next slide shows one of the buildings that visitors to Brighton would have seen from the end of the 18th century. It is the Chapel Royal, built in 1793 as a chapel of ease for St. Nicholas Church. Besides needing to relieve the overcrowding in the church, It was hoped that as the chapel was near to the Prince of Wales's marine pavilion, it would encourage him to attend church more regularly, but it seemed that this did not work. It is said that the prince was offended by a preacher giving a sermon on morality, after which he never attended the Chapel Royal again. This print is by George Wise, and like many of these prints, which I'm sure you've already observed, they have labels which are on the inside and very often dated, as this one is, which is April 1807. The building of the Royal Mews, by contrast, was a project more favoured by the Prince of Wales. In 1803, he appointed William Porden to design and build new stables. This is a view of the pavilion stables with a tree in the foreground. The next slide is a very rare view of the entrance to the Mews, with a guard at the gate, and also with Prince of Wales feathers either side of the gateway. And it's something I have never seen before or since that one. We now move to a view of Mrs. Fitzherbert's house, which was also designed by William Porden. Mrs. Fitzherbert had married the Prince of Wales in 1785, but the marriage was declared illegal under English law as she was a Roman Catholic. Mrs. Fitzherbert lived in the house with the green veranda seen in the centre of the picture. She was there from 1804 and remained there for the rest of her life, in spite of the Prince marrying Caroline of Brunswick. On the left of the print is Marlborough House, which was bought by the Duke of Marlborough in 1771 and let out when he was not using it. One could imagine that this could be just the sort of house where Mr. and Mrs. Rushworth might have stayed on their honeymoon in Brighton. Subscription libraries, which also appear on Tunbridgeware, provided one of the earliest amusements visitors to Brighton and other holiday locations in the late 18th century. They were important establishments where visitors could sign the Master of Ceremonies book to announce their arrival in town. Visitors could also converse, listen to music, buy souvenirs such as Tunbridgeware, gamble at Pam or Loo, or take part in raffles, with Tunbridgeware sometimes being a prize. Jane Austen well knew the attractions of libraries at seaside resorts. Mrs. Whitby's circulating library operated in Sanditon, Jane Austen's last and unfinished novel. It was to the library that Mr. Parker first went on his return to Sanditon after his eventful journey from Tunbridge, where he inspected the list of subscribers to see if any new important visitors had arrived, and where he took his guest, Charlotte Haywood. The library, of course, afforded everything, all the useless things in the world that could not be done without. But Charlotte resisted the temptation of the trays of rings and brooches and bought instead a copy of Fanny Burney's Camilla. There were two libraries in Brighton, Woodgate's on the south side of the Steam, or Donaldson's on the east side, which proved very popular, especially as Mr. Donaldson was appointed as bookseller and librarian to the Prince of Wales. It could have been either of these establishments that Lydia Bennet in Pride and Prejudice might have visited. Like Charlotte Haywood, Lydia was equally impressed with the temptations offered at the library. She wrote to her mother from Brighton that they had just returned from the library, where such and such officers had attended them, where she had seen such beautiful ornaments as made her quite wild. One could well believe that Lydia, unlike Charlotte, would be unable to resist the temptations on offer at the library. This print of Donaldson's library is on a circular pincushion and dates to around 1806. Several libraries, apart from Brighton, appear on Tunbridgeware. For example, Knuckles at Broadstairs, with a print, and this is on the box on the right, with a label saying Knuckles Library, Broadstairs, and that was published by Thomas Wise, 24th of March 1806. I have included on the left of this a picture of a cribboard showing Margate Harbour because it has a label indicating that it was sold at Betterson's Library. Betterson's was built in 1786 and arguably was the finest ever built in a seaside resort. It proved very popular with the wealthy and fashionable visitors. We now move to Ramsgate, which was a place visited by Jane Austen in 1803 when her brother Frank was stationed there to organise the Navy's coastal defences against Napoleon. Jane mentions Ramsgate in Pride and Prejudice and Mansfield Park, and in her letters, Jane refers to Ramsgate and Brighton together almost as a two-centre holiday location. In 1804, Jane's brother Edward and family also visited Ramsgate, staying at Sion Hill overlooking the harbour and very close to the spot where one Sir William Curtis was having a house built. This was called Cliff House and is shown on this games box. Although an uncommon view on Tunbridgeware, its existence does reflect the importance of Sir William, a businessman and politician of great wealth, and I have to say some vulgarity, who in his controversial life did much for Ramsgate and who was a friend and financier of the Prince of Wales. He is the subject of another talk and not for today. The next view I'd like to show you is also a location by the sea, Kingsgate near Broadstairs, taking its name from the spot where Charles II was reputedly forced to land in a storm whilst fleeing to France in 1683. It shows the location where Henry Fox, Lord Holland, built himself a holiday home in 1760. It is thought that he misappropriated money from the public purse to do so. The house itself he called Holland House, and then he built an estate of follies, including a Gothic ruin mock castle on the headland, intended originally as stabling but never used as such. Not to my knowledge was it ever visited or written about by Austen, but I would like to think that she might have read comments made by her favourite poet, William Cowper. He made these tongue-in-cheek remarks when he visited in 1779. There was not at that time much to be seen in the Isle of Thanet besides the beauty of the country and the fine prospects of the sea. One sight, however, I remember engaged my curiosity and I went to see it. A fine piece of ruins built by the late Lord Holland at great expense, which the day after I saw it tumbled down for nothing. Perhaps, therefore, it is still a ruin, and if it is, I would advise you by all means to visit it, as it must have been much improved by this fortunate incident. It is hardly possible to put stones together with that air of wild and magnificent disorder which they are sure to acquire by falling of their own accord. The close-up you see of the print on the box shows the castle, the mock castle on the headland, and Holland House, named exactly the same as Lord Holland's house in London, on the right of the picture. We now move to our final seaside location, which is Worthing, a place Jane visited for a holiday in 1805 with her sister Cassandra and her brother Edward and family. Jane's niece Fanny tells us that they visited Battle Abbey on the way to Worthing. You can see a small basket with a view of the Abbey at the top of the slide. It seems that Jane stayed some weeks in Worthing and is likely to have visited the library there. Stafford's Marine Library appears on Tunbridgeware, but I do not have a picture of it that I can show you. However, instead I'm showing you Warwick House, which is very close to where Jane stayed. It has been suggested that this building was Jane's inspiration for Trafalgar House in Sanditon, but this is unproven. However, it was used, I think, to let out, and I found something by somebody called Paul Potion, and I think he probably is a doctor, and that was a pseudonym. in 1814, he wrote a poetical picture of Worthing and its vicinity, and this is what he said. Just opposite the colonnade stands Warwick House in gay parade, which from its scale may surely boast itself the pride of England's coast. We now move away from the seaside, and the next place to look at is Bath, which was a place well known to Jane Austen, as she lived there between 1801 and 1806. Both Northanger Abbey and Persuasion are partly set in Bath. Jane mentions streets and well-known locations, and she talks about a print shop in Persuasion where Admiral Croft regularly stopped to look at prints of ships displayed in the window. Views of Bath can also be found in early Tunbridge Ware, but in my experience, they're not as frequent as one might expect. The views I have to show you are of Bath Abbey and the Pump Room, which brings to mind this delightful quote from Northanger Abbey when Catherine Morland and Mrs. Allen were trying to make new friends in Bath. Every morning brought its regular duties, the pump room to be attended where they paraded up and down for an hour, looking at everybody and speaking to no one. Several views of Tunbridge Wells exist, but they also don't come up as often as one might expect them to. Austen knew about the attractions of Tunbridge Wells for wealthy visitors such as Mary Crawford in Mansfield Park and fortune seekers like Isabella Thorpe in Northanger Abbey. Although Jane did not visit Tunbridge Wells, she no doubt had heard about the town from her cousin Eliza, who visited in 1787 and 1796 to sample the entertainments that the town had to offer. The first print I'm going to show you is York House, which still exists in the High Street, albeit now somewhat hidden by a later building added to the front. This was used as a lodging house for visitors such as Eliza. I now move to the second print, which is of the Walks in Tunbridge Wells. The print is labelled as being printed by Jasper Sprange and is on a games box. It was printed about 1800 and the box was probably made by Thomas Wise, who, besides being a Tunbridgeware maker, was also an auctioneer and used Sprange to print his auction handbills. And finally, my last view is of Cheltenham Sherborne Spa. We know that Jane Austen went to Cheltenham in May 1816 in the hope that the chalybeate water would help her as she was by then coming towards the end of her life. A guide to watering places tells us that the water was advertised as being singularly efficacious in all bilious complaints, obstructions of the liver and spleen. She stayed in Cheltenham for 2 weeks. The town may have been chosen for her to visit as there were several different wells that they could go to. It would not, however, have been the Sherborne Spa that Jane visited, but this was not opened until 1818, the year after her death. I'm now going to move on to veneered items, which are recorded as being sold in Tunbridge Wells from the 1760s, but there is no evidence what these might have looked like until the end of the 18th century and into the early 19th century. Tunbridgeware designs from that period include veneers of large perspective cubes, triangular patterns known as Van Dykes, and starbursts. This slide shows a writing slope with the Van Dyke pattern, and also please note the diamond pattern in the middle of the box, which I will refer back to in a few minutes. The lower box is a paint box and has large cube decoration, and both of these combine native and foreign veneers. In the 18th century, exotic woods had increasingly found their way to England from the British colonies, about which we are told in Persuasion when Austen gives us a rare glimpse of the contents of Captain Harville's home, mentioning some few articles of rare species of wood, excellently worked up, and with something curious and valuable from all the distant countries Captain Harville had visited. This mention of wood by Austen was likely prompted by her brothers Edward and Frank, whose interest in wood turning as a genteel pastime is recorded in a letter to Cassandra. These veneered items that I've just shown you are today recognisable as Tunbridgeware from the early 19th century, but we are somewhat at a loss to know what veneered Tunbridgeware might have looked like before 1800 and what the Austens were perhaps using in the dressing room at Steventon Rectory. It seems that the only chance we have of discovering what these items might have been like is if we can find anything of the period that is labelled naming the maker as a Tunbridgeware manufacturer. It is, of course, possible that the term Tunbridgeware was used very loosely to describe a whole range of wooden items, or to describe something that simply had been bought in a shop selling Tunbridgeware. For example, this workbox is by Malcolm Dunnett and is labelled Dunnett's and is described as being sold at his toy and Tunbridgeware repository. The label dates it to 1803, and it was therefore later than the Austen owned Tunbridgeware. But labels of this type might have been sufficient for an item to be referred to as Tunbridgeware. There is, however, one maker from this period I would like to mention who did label, saying he was actually a Tunbridgeware manufacturer. He was John Robinson, and the only maker known to have traded in Tunbridgeware both in London and Tunbridge Wells. Robinson seems to have been trading in Tunbridge Wells from 1792, and we are fortunate to have handbills produced for him by Jasper Sprange between 1795 and 1797. On these handbills, he lists some of the Tunbridgeware he is offering. Some items are fairly predictable, like tea caddies and sewing boxes, but others are more unusual, such as salad servers and earrings. He also mentions York spinning wheels. York was an area known for wood turning, and Joseph Doughty was a renowned spinning wheel maker. Spinning was a popular pastime for young ladies in the 18th century. Jane Austen mentions spinning wheels on 2 occasions in her letters, but does not elaborate as to their origin. I have only ever owned 2 pieces of Robinson Tunbridgeware. The first was a tea caddy with a label with his address at 34 Duke Street, St James, where Robinson was based between 1795 and 1798. You will see a picture of it on this slide with a very handsome label which was on the base with a royal coat of arms. He advertised that he did supply things to the royal family, and a lot of his business was outside the Tunbridgeware with perfume and hairdressing and so forth. The caddy has got marquetry inlay and is not similar to any other Tunbridgeware that we know. The second piece is this cabinet, which I have just been added to my stock, and which you can see on my page of the BADA website. It shows his address as 53 Piccadilly, where he was in 1798. The cabinet has diamond-shaped inlay, very similar to that you have just seen on the writing slope, and it also uses a range of foreign woods. The background wood to the cabinet is Gonçalo Alves, or zebra wood, from Brazil, and the inside is all cedar, which is not being polished and never has been. And the drawer handles are all original, silver plated with drop ring pulls, and are delightful to see something so original now. The label is on the inside of one of the drawers, and you can actually read a bit more about this on the website. Could these pieces have been more like what Jane Austen might have known? Even so, whilst these and a few of the printed decorated items might date before 1800, it is unlikely that in spite of our best efforts, we can produce pictorial evidence much before 1790. And what we do have only adds up to a very incomplete picture of Tunbridgeware from the 18th century. As far as I am concerned, the mystery continues, and I keep looking. that brings me to the end of my presentation, and I thank you for listening. And if anyone has any questions, please do write it into the Q&A box and I will try to answer them.